On the podcast this week, Education Lab founder Kathleen deLaski talks about her book, Who Needs College Anymore, with Brian Rosenberg of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The book offers a reimagined look at what higher education might offer and whom it should serve in the future through 10 top principles for reform using human-centered design. Kathleen deLaski created the Education Design Lab in 2013. Her career has included overseeing the deLaski Family Foundation, a grant maker in education reform. She also spent 20 years as a journalist, including time as ABC News White House correspondent, followed by an appointment as the first female Pentagon spokesperson.
Well, welcome, Kathleen. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to have a conversation with you. It's a pleasure to read your book. There are a lot of things you could do with your life. Why did you decide to do this thing? Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, that's a great first question, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to my friends who are here and others for coming out today. I would say that I really the personal motivation for writing this book actually started back maybe 15 years ago when my own children were going through this cycle, of trying to figure out what am I going to do when I grow up, how hard do I need to run, how do I get through this gauntlet that is supposed to take me to a college, and not only any college, but like a really good college where my parents can speak proudly of me when they go to my soccer games. And for us in my family, it didn't go well. That process did not go well. And so I think I was radicalized early. I mean, they both struggled to do well in high school, to figure out what they were going to do after. And they felt very bad about themselves. I mean, they both had physical and mental consequences from being so worried and nervous about this road to college. And so that on a personal front, I think that's actually part of what prompted me to start this organization that Hannah mentioned, the Education Design Lab, which really kind of strives to work with colleges to create other kinds of pathways, shorter term pathways, so that it's not just a college or bust mentality. And so it's not just like, oh, you're not going to college? Then I guess you're going to trade school. Trade school's great. And I think more people are actually going to trade school right now, but it's not the only path in this in the age that we're entering. I believe, and so then this is sort of the professional reason I wrote the book. I believe that we are on the cusp of an era when it won't matter so much because there are so many short-term training opportunities and learning opportunities that both businesses and companies and colleges now are starting to provide for folks, that you don't absolutely have to go to college to make it to have your ticket to the American dream. And with 62% of Americans not having a four-year degree, I mean, when I started to really think about that number, that's a majority of Americans who do not have a four-year degree. And yet, in a place like this, in an area like Cambridge, or an area where I live, in the DC area, wow, you're made to feel like nothing if you aren't on that track. And so I really wrote the book to lift up the other pathways, because there are many, but we need a lot more, and we need to fund them and research them and advocate them at the same level that we do the four-year degree.
So a couple of follow-up questions. Your radicalization that you described, to what extent is it reflected in the title of the book? That is, one can read the title of the book in two ways. One can read it as saying, who needs college anymore? Right. Or one could read it as a genuine question. Yes. So who does need college now? I'm guessing that the title can be read in two different ways. So talk a little bit about which of those ways, or whether you want the readers to look at it through both of those lenses. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that question, because if my interviewer, when I've been on this book tour, doesn't bring it up, I do bring it up, because I do not mean it the first way that you suggested it, which was, who needs college anymore? I absolutely am pro-college. I think, I was laughing with my college roommates who are here, these are my lifelong friends, and my grad school friends who are here. I went to grad school down the street. The people that you meet and the networks that you make in college and in graduate school, if you were lucky enough to do that, are so important and become your lifelong really the way that you track your life. And so in no way am I saying that if college is available to you financially, and you have the let's call it the academic identity to want to sit in a desk for 4 more years or 6 or 8 more years or whatever your path is, or if you have a job desire, a career ambition that absolutely will probably for many, many decades require a degree, doctor, lawyer, accountant, unfortunately, they've just upped the requirements for that, physical therapist, clinical psychologist, any of these kinds of roles, absolutely you need college. But that's not to say that if you want to find a workaround, but you still want an economic path that can get you to the same level as somebody who has a degree, I believe we are on the cusp of that being much more of a possibility. It's fuzzy right now because we haven't burned the pathways very well yet, but I give a whole chapter to this question: who needs college anymore? And I use research and human-centered design methodology to come up with what we call personas, so kind of typologies of people who can afford to skip the 4-year degree if those other things I just mentioned aren't in place. I'll just give one example, which is my own daughter, one of my daughters, who didn't do college in the at the traditional time frame, in that 18-year-old time frame, but when she went off to become a ballet dancer, and you pretty much have to go into an apprentice. You have to become an apprentice and go that route when you're dancing in ballet, at least. And so then she gets to her later 20s, and she's and COVID hits, and the whole ballet company's laid off, and then she really starts to look at, okay, I have to go to college now, and that's an archetype, what I call the connected career switcher. So somebody who's later in college, who isn't trying to be a doctor or a lawyer. She was interested in marketing, so she used a 8-week boot camp to part-time, $3,700. That's how much it cost her, and she parlayed her way into a first job in that field. And those are the kind of stories. A lot of them are in tech. A lot of them are things like cybersecurity and medical, technician kind of work. But there are many roles where you can get to at least a middle rung on a stepladder without a degree. And I believe that the higher rungs on those career ladders will also become available to folks as fewer people have degrees, and as AI changes things, which we can talk about at some point in the discussion. Yeah.
So what happened to College for All?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the fact that under 40% of the people in the country have a college degree. For a long time, that number was going up, in the post-war era in particular. That's not the case any longer. For a long time it was, and for many people it still is, a public policy objective. Mm-hmm. So is that over? How should we think about that? Is it a good thing that it's over, or is it a problem that it's over?
Well, I think it's good and bad that it's over. It is an issue. When I was coming along, when I was, let's say, in the 1970s, the early 80s, only like 15% of us, of American adults had a degree, which surprised me. I mean, I only learned that percentage when I went back and researched it, now writing the book. So it's really interesting that the numbers kind of dramatically went up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I was actually in the field, and I was at Sallie Mae, the student loan provider, selling the message, college is possible, trying to help more Americans access college. But it was really around 2010, I think, with the Great Recession, and many of you remember, how it was very hard to get hired after that for the kids coming out of college, and there was a lot of talk about, including one of my daughters, right? Our kids are living in our basements, and they can't get jobs, and they have degrees, and they have a ton of student debt, and that was right at the point that student debt crossed the trillion dollar mark, and so I think that was when a narrative began. It was really a grassroots narrative. So the public policy mantra did not change. And so I think it's actually caught, in the last 5 years or so, it's caught educators and policymakers by surprise that the College for All movement, is sort of, waving the white surrender flag. And I have a chapter about this too in the book, that if you go to the front lines of high schools, you'll see that a lot of families are challenging my kid has to go on the college track. Either the kid is, the student is challenging it because they don't want to take on debt, or the parents are saying, we don't think we can afford it, or what, can you figure out a way to work first, and then maybe you don't know what you want to do, and so we don't want to fund the money. And so what I chronicle in the book is a lot of high schools that are trying to now figure out how to create a message that's more, yes, we're not telling you not to go to college, but we recognize that we need to elevate other pathways and tell you about other ways to, other programs, whether short form, might be at a community college, it might be at a boot camp or an apprenticeship. Industry certifications are now starting to be offered in high school that are part of what used to be shop, in cosmetology. Now you're getting, cybersecurity certificates in high school, and you can go direct to employment if you want. And that's a pretty new development.
Yeah, I worried about the fact that I might not graduate from high school because I was going to fail shop.
Yeah.
What is your response to a different public policy approach to this, which is sort of the free college approach? Mm-hmm. So, at its most extreme, you have sort of the Bernie Sanders make all public colleges free. Less extreme version is what we have in Massachusetts now, which is essentially free community college.
Yes.
So how does that approach align with, compare with the way you think about college access?
Yeah, that's a great question. At the end of my book, I described 10 design criteria, which are, sort of the way to kind of save college as we know it. Because I'm a fan of institutions. I mean, I want them to continue. And, what I perceive is really a kind of a consumer, retreat, if you will, from the four-year degree. And so I'm trying to work with colleges to help them figure out what can we do, what can we add, how can we make the word college more of an umbrella of several different offerings, one of which is a degree, so that those of us who want to do that and can do that still will. But then there are other things, and one of them, to answer your question, is like short-term pathways that community colleges can offer and are beginning to offer that are called micro pathways. And they're really, it's really where the college is working with the local employers, in the industries that are high demand, and trying to develop a set of micro credentials, so short-term credentials that offer a credential of meaning, but that is not a four-year process. It's maybe a 6-month process, and so those are, like my organization is working with 100 community colleges right now on those around the country, and what's fascinating is that the people are all ages that are signing up for those, because there's a lot of people are finding they have to retooled, like they're suddenly learning that they have to know AI, or they have to know fiber optics, or they want to understand project management, and they're trying to get a better job. So, I really kind of describe how college can be used, and this is where the affordability piece comes in. If it doesn't cost you a lot, like if the cost of upskilling is affordable, people are much more, studies show people are much more inclined to try it out and do it, right? Because there's not the barrier to entry. And so in a place like Massachusetts, and there may be 4 or 5 states, and I mentioned Massachusetts in the book, that I'm really pleased to see that some states are trying to take affordability off the table as the reason not to, either upskill or, test out a plan for figuring out, what you want to do, and that's exciting. And if we could solve for affordability around the country, then some of these other problems would go away. And as you see in other countries, where college is, at least at the undergraduate level, right, college is free, and you don't have these issues that we're having here.
So what's been the response from colleges to a book entitled Who Needs College Anymore? Or, I mean, another way of putting that is, what's been the response from people like me? I was a faculty member for 15 years, then a dean, then a college president. We'll get to the extent to which higher education embraces change, but what has been the response so far?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that it's the innovation pockets of universities and colleges are just like all over, the book. They're like, okay, come speak at our conference. This is yeah. Can you run a seminar with our top people? I mean, that's been really fun to watch. I would say the what would you call it? The traditional part of higher ed.
The faculty?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Not so much. Or even some, college presidents who are feeling like, okay, we hear you. Yes, we definitely need change, but I don't like the title of your book, because they're reading it the first way that you said. They're thinking that I'm saying that nobody needs college anymore. When anyone who gets past the title of my book, sees that it's a whole lot more nuanced than that, and that it's really about yes and, but that the and part, I mean, the fact that we don't embrace and talk about and lift up and fund other forms of college is, I think in no small part contributing to this, the political resentment that you see expressed in, a populist uprising that we've seen this year, in the 2024 election, but even before, where you get what is being called a diploma divide, right, where the people who don't have diplomas feel like they can't get an economic break, and the people who do have diplomas, don't understand why the other people are upset,
One of the things I admire about the book is that it is it's very optimistic. It's very positive. I want to ask about the basis for the optimism. Mm-hmm. So higher education, as I think we probably would both agree, is not an industry that has embraced change, particularly dramatic change. Mm-hmm. Tends to move slowly, tends to move incrementally. You clearly feel this moment is different, and that things are going to look very different 10, 20, 30 years from now. Why do you think this industry that has been so change averse is going to change?
Well, fear is a great motivator. I was a college professor who was laughing over there, actually. I think that's because I've seen it in the community college space. So the community colleges in the 2010s lost 1/3 of their enrollment. And boy, I would say that sector has absolutely been the easiest for my organization to work with, because they are, every day they're saying to us, we need a new, we need a new model, right? And so what I see, what I'm very excited about in the community college space is, hundreds of colleges. I mean, there are only 1,100 community colleges in the country, and like we're working with 10% of them who are saying, we need to become the talent brokers in our regions, because community colleges still have trust. They have trust of people. People show up there to say, partly because of the affordability, but partly because this is our neighborhood, education institution. They're showing up there to learn stuff, right? And so how can they become this, people are using the term economic engine, how can they solve for, the talent shortages that the technological, skills shakeup is causing. And so I'm very optimistic about that at the community college level, and I think that will happen at the 4-year college level, maybe not at the elite colleges, but the elite colleges, and I say in the book that accounts for about 2% of seats in colleges, so about 2% of students who are in college are at elite universities. That's okay, if they don't change. I mean, it's unfortunate because there's a lot of wealth in those universities that could be shared in multiple ways, but it's okay because they'll always have enough students. In fact, elite colleges, their enrollment's up. While most colleges enrollment's down, their enrollment's up, so they don't have to change.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
And we need, as I said, we want a continuum of offerings. And so if elite colleges are still offering the same thing, that's okay. I mean, I tell the story in the book about my great grandfather times 7. He grew up here he grew up in Roxbury, but he was an early graduate of the first college in America, Harvard University, because he was the son of an indentured servant who came over as an immigrant from England, and he managed to get into Harvard somehow. It was a poor kid, 10 siblings, and he was in the class of 1673.
I think they're having the reunion.
Yeah, that's funny. And he managed in one generation to pull his family up into a position of prominence, from indentured servant to prominence, and that's a story that is repeated in many families, down through the ages, right, for the next 350 years. Like, a lot of us have a story like that, where higher education was the ticket, or college was the ticket. And so what I'm saying is that's not, that dream doesn't go away easily. Plus all of us have, wonderful memories with our college roommates and, graduate school friends. We like, the nostalgia will carry that piece of, or that model of college a long way, and the brands will carry, themselves. But I'm very optimistic about what happens to the rest of the market to serve the rest of the market.
So Clayton Christensen, the late Clayton Christensen, and I think you actually have a quote from his collaborator Michael Horn on the book. His theory of disruption is that it's more likely to happen from without than from within, and he talked about that for years and years before he unfortunately passed away. Do you think that what we're likely to see is change within these 4-year institutions? Or do you think what we're more likely to see is new institutions, organizations, startups change this world from without?
That's a great question. I think that 10 years ago, and one of the reasons I started the lab was because I was worried about higher education, like colleges, getting like Ubered, like what Uber did to taxis, right? Which is that they kind of took over the market. 10 or 12 years later, that's not exactly the way it's playing out. What I write about in the book, in a chapter I call The Great College Reset, and that I see beginning to happen, but it hasn't, the dam hasn't broken yet, is an unbundling of the degree to the point that other people will win in the distribution game, like Amazon, let's say. So colleges are really bad at distribution. They're really maybe good at the content, right, and the experience and the professors and the credentialing, right? But because people aren't going to be willing to pay the full price, the average degree is costing, and if you include all, the inexpensive ones, it's like $38,000 a year for the, if you factor in all of the different colleges. And so people aren't going to be willing to pay that into the future, in my view, or pay the $200,000 for a more, a nicer college. And so as it gets unbundled, the part of the game becomes the distribution and the packaging, right? And colleges are not very good at that. So that is increasingly being done already by groups like, if you know Coursera, there are like third parties who are, basically unbundling and repackaging stacks of, learning stacks, so that you can get your, your Google IT certificate or your project management credential from the Project Management Institute, or something from, data security from Cisco. Like you're basically going to have resellers that will give you what you need when you need it. And so colleges, I think, will be disrupted, but what they will, I think, be able to hang on to their basic product, which is these learning, these learning credentials, but they're going to have to probably sell them increasingly through other resellers.
Let's talk about AI. Is AI for you something that makes you smile or makes you furrow your brow with worry?
Well, I'm smiling at first because everybody's like, this is kind of, everybody's talking about it, and I would say that the ground has moved even further, since I finished writing the book. But I certainly point to what is and was coming, and I wouldn't reword anything about the trend lines. So I say, with respect to like going to school in the future or trying to get hired in the future, that AI is good and bad, right? On the good side, we already have better and better tools to kind of have visibility into your own future and like where you stand against that future. So it creates more agency for you. And I'm already seeing every day, and I'm working with folks who are creating various killer apps for career navigation, or I described digital wallets are coming to to an iPhone near you pretty soon, right? A digital wallet where you would be able to house all your skills that you've learned from anywhere, not just in school, but anywhere that you've learned. And then you can reorganize these, or AI will organize them for you, like a Hollywood agent, right? That's helping you get hired to go after that job. And so that's all great, right? And I'm not even mentioning like the learning aids in terms of tutoring and helping you write your English papers, right? That's probably, someone else can be expert on that. But then on the negative side, for consumers and learners and people trying to get jobs, you already see it happening that new graduates coming out of college are in sort of what we used to call white collar fields, are seeing the elimination of entry level jobs. We're already seeing it. And so it's harder for them to get hired. And so what does that mean? I mean, what I write about in the book is it means you need more than a degree, right? Or at least the degree that we've had in the past. You also need to be able to differentiate yourself with preferably career-related experience. And so a number of colleges are looking at, okay, how do we do that? Maybe this is our job to help land the student at the door of their first job, because we're not giving them enough in this fast-changing day and age where everyone coming out of college, has AI write their resume and all of our skills look the same. Like, you really need a differentiator. And how do we do that for people? Well, one way that colleges are looking at doing that is, let's help them get apprenticeships during college. Let's help them get industry certifications. Like, we have to help certify them. And I profile a university down the street in that regard, which is probably the best known in the country for this, which is Northeastern University. I mean, everyone probably in this room knows of them, but their co-op model has been, excellent for helping students like figure that out.
Well, we could talk for 2 hours about AI, but
Right.
I want to be aware of time and ask you something else about the current moment. You mentioned that, you know, if you had written this book now, you might say some things differently. In the last month since you wrote this book, the terrain under higher education has shifted dramatically.
Yes.
If you were to write the book today, would that change the book in any way?
Wow. I might think twice about the title just because I feel like I'm, you know, am I kicking higher ed when it's down? I just wrote a blog about this yesterday, which is, wow, I feel like I need to apologize to my friends who feel kind of beaten up. And why do they feel beaten up? Okay, well, just this month, you know, the Department of Education is, you know, in, at least you could say it's in chaos. It, you know, maybe going away completely. The student loan program, which, you know, undergirds and finances everybody going to college, is, you know, a little bit homeless right now as we try to figure out, is it going to go to the Small Business Administration? I mean, I had one friend yesterday say, well, yeah, we're not going to have our kid apply to college because we don't know what's happening to student loans. And I tried to assure her, you know, I'm sure they'll be fine, but, you know, it's just a tough time for higher ed. You know, they just feel, you know, academia feels, you know, beaten up. And so is it a good time to have an innovation discussion, right? I mean, in my mind, it's probably a great time to have an innovation discussion if you believe the, you know, the maxim, never waste a good crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it is that existential crisis that I said is required for innovation to happen. So, you know, that's why I can't decide how I feel about, you know, would I have written anything differently?
Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to get too political here, but, you know, when colleges and universities in the U.S. were founded, we talked about this a little bit, by people like Jefferson and Franklin. They were very explicit in their goals, and that is that higher education had more than one purpose. It had the vocational purpose, but as they both said, in multiple settings and in multiple ways, you cannot have a democracy without an educated citizenry. So that part of the role of education was to prepare people to be engaged citizens. So how do we preserve that if we transition to these new models, which are clearly more, for the most part, more vocationally focused? Is the notion that education is in part to maintain the public good and a kind of democratic community, is that just gone now?
I mean, I think the question is, how much are people willing to pay for that part? And that's, you know, I think if we could make that part free or bake it in K-12 more, is, you know, people have talked about. And I call on colleges to think about, particularly ones who are in financial trouble, well, why don't you think about taking the lovely college experience part and the critical thinking, you know, cohorts that you create. Can you package that as maybe a shorter boot camp that people could afford? The question, though, is even then, would they, if you didn't make them do it, would they do it? And I don't know the answer to that. Remember I mentioned that with community colleges, we're doing these micro pathways that are short-term, short form, like 6-month programs. We are kind of forcing on them a component of that tries to retain a little bit of the liberal arts and general education by requiring, you know, to sort of qualify to be a micro pathway, you have to have at least one micro credential in something like critical thinking, mm-hmm. or collaboration, or creative problem solving. And that's, you know, that's our, you know, effort to try to preserve general education, but it's, you know, it certainly wouldn't live up to anything that Jefferson or Franklin would be proud of.
We're about at the end of our time. I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, but let me just ask you one more question. Jump ahead 30 years. What percentage of people do you think will be in what we consider college now? Either the 2-year community college version or the 4-year version. And what percentage of people do you think will be pursuing these other pathways that you outlined that are clearly beginning to gain more traction? So what will the world look like in 30 years?
Well, I suggest that probably 30%, maybe a third of people will still get some kind of degree, in 30 years. And, that's not that much less than get them today. I mean, we have about 10% of people are getting community college degrees. So, it goes from 50 maybe to 30% all in. But I think what's more, remarkable is today the 50 to 60% of people who aren't getting, any formalized training, or because the number of people doing apprenticeships, for example, is minuscule right now, and yet everyone loves the model. We're just not funding it. And same with industry certification. So I think what will be more remarkable in 30 years is the people who aren't getting served will be served, as opposed to like how many fewer people are getting a degree. Maybe that's not as big of a number.
Yeah. And what we can't lose sight of is the fact that of the people who are starting 4-year degrees right now, only about 60% of them actually complete them. Right. And the economic benefits of a college degree only begin to accrue if you complete it.
That's absolutely right.
So there's a lot to fix.
Before we go to question, though, I wanted you, so Brian, one of the reasons he was asked to interview me was because he has written a very successful book, also for Harvard Education Press, which we have up here too, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It. And I wanted you to have a chance to say, what are you, whatever it is, what are we against, or what's the against that you're talking about in your book?
Change. Higher education has been the industry that has changed the least over the last century, probably in the world. It's in some ways a paradox because it's filled with smart people. And the mission statement of virtually every college in the country talks about wanting to provide a transformational experience to their students. But try getting a college to transform itself. And I have spent my whole career in that world. And I've come to the conclusion that the problems are not that people don't want to do a good job, but that there are so many structural and cultural impediments to change. It's kind of higher education has created the perfect system if you don't want to change. And that is not serving it well right now. And as much as I bemoan the attacks from without, I think it's important for higher education to acknowledge that in some ways it's made itself an easy target because it's gotten too expensive. 40% of the students don't graduate, and it's still doing a lot of the same things that were done when Jefferson went to college. So that's why I decided to write the book.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And now we do have time for questions, and I think we have a microphone. So.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
It's incredibly cathartic. That confirmed everything and every reason why I left. But my question is for Kathleen. I'd love to hear you talk about the relationship between labor policy and education policy. And this comes, maybe we should talk at the state level, because I don't know what's going on at the federal level for that, if anyone's even going to pay attention to that. But my question is, we have a lot of jobs, a lot of needs that don't have enough people in them, right? We don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough home health care aides.
Right.
In your experience, how do you break through the conversation with higher ed about looking at labor market needs and responding in a way that actually helps the economics of individuals, but then also of states and I suppose of the country, by attending to them so that we don't have shortages in these key areas?
That's such a great point. So the programs I mentioned that are happening at community colleges, I think are really, that's the big aha, exactly what you just said. That's the big aha people are having, is that, we can actually be responsive in short order to immediate economic demands of regions. Just a couple of quick examples, like the semiconductor, the CHIPS Act. There was an act passed, 2 years ago by Congress to try to bring back to the U.S. the semiconductor industry after we learned in COVID that we didn't have one. And so community colleges really kind of jumped into the game, and four-year colleges too, jumped into the game to say, okay, we're going to help figure out how to create the talent pipelines, and Congress provided money for them to do that. I mean, that's one example at the kind of like, national security level. I think another example at let's take teachers. So one of the things that is a movement that's happening that I'm really excited about is called apprenticeship degrees. It's this idea, and I feature an example in the book, where you can, there aren't enough teachers, right? So there are people in the buildings working in, K-12 schools who would love to be teachers, right? But they can't jump through the hoops to get the degree because, like the woman I profile, single mom, the college where she'd have to go get her teaching degree is, like 40 miles away. But so they're bringing what apprenticeship degrees is doing is bringing those programs to the school and paying them while they're making it work so that you can keep your job as a teacher's aide or a custodian. I mean, even the custodians are becoming teachers. It's really exciting. And this is part of my optimism, is I see a lot of these kind of programs happening around the country. And that particular model is happening in teaching, and it's happening with in sort of the different steps of nursing, because there's some steps of nurse you can be without a degree, but it helps you move up the pay ladder and the learning ladder in a flexible, step ladder approach.
Any more questions? Over here.
So I was just curious what the end goal of the 6-month sort of micro program is, because I know community colleges usually either are doing prep work for then going to universities, or they're doing some form of trade school. But I was wondering what, is there a specific job that they can get with the 6 months? Is it just for the sake of education?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking for that clarification, because absolutely the point is to be able to be hired immediately after that short-term credential. But what's maybe different from a trade school or even a boot camp is that with these micro pathways, there's a visibility created all the way to degree if you want that, and hopefully a pathway for you to get the additional training while you're working, because 65% of students have to work while they're in college. That's the national statistic, and 40% are working full-time. And so the idea that you are going to be able to just, go off to your leafy campus and study at night, this is not the way it is for most people. And so we're trying to create pathways that have the flexibility of, earn and learn at the same time. So absolutely there's a credential that can get you hired, because the employers have designed these pathways with the school. That's the model. So the idea is earn and learn, move up the ladder, or go straight to work, come back if you want, but you don't have to come back if you are happy with your pay status. Does that answer the question?
Oh, yeah. So it's mostly done with employers.
Oh, absolutely. They're all done with employers. I mean, we're only creating a program if the employers, express demand. And there's now, one of the things that's exciting about now versus like 10 years ago, and this gets to the labor market question too, is there are great new data sources that are available and in fact the Harvard Project on Workforce is working with colleges and labor market data to kind of look at, okay, where do we have shortages? Like, where would it be useful for the community college to come in and create a program? And we're doing ones, I would say 6 or 7 sectors are really, pretty equally hot between healthcare, tech, manufacturing, education, and construction management, all those fields. Yeah.
So I noticed you didn't really touch on the topic of internships at all. I'm not sure 100% how to formulate this question, but just, I guess, how that has been kind of historically a sort of between a college and an employer, that sort of trade learning, but that it's often extremely inaccessible to the people that don't have the money because most internships don't pay you while you're doing those things. So I was just wondering if you had any sort of thoughts on how that can be transformed, or if that's something that will just naturally go away with the rest of the...
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that, because I definitely talk about that in the book, about how, internships, historically have been a pretty elitist situation, right? That if you don't need to get paid in the summer because your parents are funding you, you can do a career-enhancing, internship, and those are the people that get hired at the end of their four-year degree. The good news is, I think, and I was just talking to an HR specialist about this, it's becoming more and more the practice that interns have to be paid. And the bad news is it's having a little bit of a dampening effect on the number of internships available, right? But I think overall that's a good thing. But there actually have been some reports recently about how I think students more and more get the idea that, oh, I need to do an internship. I mean, that's kind of universally understood, but it isn't that easy to get an internship in your field, particularly if you're in the humanities or the social sciences. I know I teach at George Mason University, a large public in Virginia, and we did a whole class on this, and I have majors who were from cyber to English to art to business, and they were the more liberal arts majors were kind of resentful that there were no internships available to them that were career enhancing, and partly because they didn't know necessarily what their degree was going to track to yet. They wanted an internship to help figure that out, but the businesses that wanted people and that were lined up at the college door were engineers, cyber, and that's about where it left off actually.
Is one version of this future where the businesses just do it themselves? So you end up essentially with Walmart U and Amazon U and Target U, where they just take students from high school and say, you know what, we're just going to cut out the middle, yep. And we're just going to train you ourselves.
I raised that question in the book, that very question, because it's a concern of colleges, and it helps motivate them to be more of the middleman. I mean, the good news that will save colleges, I think, is that it's messy, right? Like training is messy, and we still see, however much they complain, however much companies complain about how, universities and colleges are not responsive enough or don't move at the speed of business, however much they complain, they still don't want to do it themselves because it's expensive and it's it's time consuming, it's ever changing. So I mean, I think in some fields you see this happening a little bit, but it's more they're fishing upstream. Companies are fishing upstream. In other words, they're capturing students in high school more because they're either desperate, they need at least one pipeline to figure out how to get their early talent, or what they do is easy and repetitive, and that's where you see kind of like manufacturing apprenticeships. They're willing to, they do often try to get people right out of high school. But I don't think that colleges, if they can figure it out, they could be disrupted, but I don't think they'll be disrupted by the companies doing it themselves.
I'm just curious about both of your opinions as to whether the federal Department of Education has been an agent and an encouraging force for change, or whether it's been part of the resistance.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm happy to give you the perspective of a former college president. I don't think that you would find many college and university presidents who, if you strap them to a lie detector, would say they're in love, or they have been in love with the Department of Education. And that's not to say it hasn't done a lot of good things. But Part of the problem is that the Department of Education issues a lot of directives that don't have the force of law, but have the force of threat. And every time the administration changes, you get a whole new set of those. So Title IX is a great example. I was a college president for 17 years. Every time the administration changed, we got a whole new set of directives about how to handle Title IX, which sometimes meant completely dismantling offices, hiring new people, then getting rid of the people that you hired. So those regulations could sometimes be very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, the Department of Education has been essential for a function that people don't talk enough about, and that is data collection. So the only way we even know how many students we're graduating is because of the Department of Education. The only way we know which schools are doing a good job and which schools are not is through the Department of Education. The only way we know the demographics of the student population is through the Department of Education. Every college in the country relies on Department of Education data to benchmark themselves and to understand the landscape. That's going away. And there is no form of work that gets better when you don't have information. And so to me, that's one risk of essentially exploding the department. The other is it handles all of the student loans, Pell Grants. It is a complicated and specialized business, easily messed up, and the Department of Education last year had a complete fiasco with the new FAFSA form, financial aid form, which wreaked havoc on a lot of institutions. But most of the people who do that work have now been fired. And it's being moved to another agency where most of the people have also already been fired and don't have that expertise. So the potential for a complete disaster around both Pell Grants and student loans and just general submission of financial aid information is great. So yes, it could be a pain in the neck, but it performs some functions that without which the system just can't operate. And I don't know how it's going to operate without those functions.
What he said. I would just add that one small note, which is I don't know if I'd be able to write this book in 2 years, right? Because it's all based on Department of Education trend lines and statistics about who needs college anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have 30 footnotes in the book that I wouldn't have been able to include without Department of Education data.
What about disabled students? I believe the statistics say about over 20% of students identify as disabled, including mental and physical disabilities. Public universities have an incentive to level the playing field for them. There are whole departments, to make sure they have access to education. A private-owned boot camp, is that going to happen?
Right, well, this is why I definitely believe that colleges need to continue to play the role in supporting degrees and the other forms that come up, apprenticeships, short-term certifications, short-term pathways. Colleges are the best equipped, but largely because of the mandates and requirements and the strings attached to their federal money. That's why I still want colleges to be in the game, and why my brand of fix and disrupt is really to try to help colleges, sort of fix their own problem, rather than help other organizations or venture capitalists come in and try to consumerize the market. I mean, the good news about if you're worried about the private sector coming in and taking over higher education, the good news in that respect, I just met with a group of venture capitalists about this, there's not very much money in it, right? So when they come in, they sniff around, they call me all the time, they're looking at the market, but then they realize that they can't take over community colleges. Community college, it costs very little to go to a community college. There's not enough money to go around to, so I'm not that worried about venture capitalists or, like as I said, like an Uber kind of app taking over the basic construct. And I do, assuming we don't lose these federal government roles, I think there will always be a place to have the supports that students students of need have, whether it's neurodivergent or other kinds of disabilities.
It's a complicated question. One of the things that colleges and universities have had to become over the last decade or two is, in the case of many students, they're a major healthcare provider, both physical and mental health. And I can tell you from having done this for a couple of decades, it's an uphill battle. During my time as a college president, we doubled the size of our counseling center, and students still had a 3-week wait. And so, but the fact that we were able to do that meant that we got a lot of those students through. And one of the things you see with still a lot of online programs and a lot of these shorter programs is, the low cost eliminates a barrier to entry, but they also don't finish. So the completion rates are very, very low. And so we have not yet, in my view at least, found the right balance between something that is much lower cost but provides a lot of the services that gets a lot of these students through. It's not an easy problem to solve because it is expensive. People talk about the rise in administrators at colleges and universities. Who do you think those people are? People picture, I guess, people like me. I don't know, college now has 5 presidents. It used to have 1. That's not who they are. There are people who work in Title IX offices, in disability services offices, in IT. Just think about how IT has changed over the last 20 years. Every single one of those people is counted as an administrator. So have the number of administrators gone up? Absolutely. But that's been driven in part by federal regulation and by student needs. So replicating that at a much lower cost is really, really hard. And so clearly you can have everything. And so if you're going to have a much lower cost degree, you're also going to lose a lot of the things that come with a higher cost degree. And that's just a decision that people individually and the society as a whole is going to have to make.
Hi, so I'm curious about the role of community in these alternative pathways. So you mentioned about your own experience with your college roommates. Obviously, there's a very real value in terms of social capital. As we explore these shorter and alternative, perhaps online modality pathways, what role does community have to play?
Great question. I think one of the 10 design criteria that I ask for as we think about how to respond to these changes that consumers are requesting is exactly that. Like at least for the 18 to 24-year-old, that we need to retain some form of community. And I give the example of a program like, how many of you know about Year Up? Year Up is usually it's like a year-long program that is provided in many regions around the country for lower income students who can't necessarily afford to go to college, but still want both the community aspect and the general education aspect, but also the career training. And it gets bundled into 1 year, and companies are sponsors, and they provide 6-month internships. And it's had super successful outcomes over the last 25 years. In fact, I'm doing a panel tomorrow with the founder who's teaching at the business school right now, because I am trying to lift up Year Up as an example Like, why can't Year Up be a form of college? It has better outcomes than many colleges. It's the reason it hasn't scaled around the country is because it's totally supported by philanthropy. They've tried to get federal money, but it's never worked out. And so, and they're working with some colleges. So, like, why can't colleges partner with them to bring that model in as one short-term form of college that's been, tried and tested for 25 years? That's an example of how, and those folks are gaining community. I went around and interviewed them in different cities, and they're getting what I was getting, but I will say a shorter form of it, but also at a much lower cost.
Thanks for listening to this conversation from March. Next week on the Afterwards podcast, the mysterious Mrs. Nixon, the life and times of Washington's most private First Lady. And remember, the interviews heard on this podcast are drawn from our book TV programs that air every weekend on C-SPAN 2 television.